It is striking how many countries are now being drawn into this quagmire, into this extraordinarily widening conflict.
The escalating war between the United States and Iran is already hitting Africa, and the consequences are unfolding faster than many expected. Within days of the conflict intensifying, global shipping companies began diverting vessels away from traditional routes, pushing more cargo traffic around Africa's coastline. At the same time, fuel prices are climbing in some African markets, and governments across the continent are watching closely as trade routes, security discussions, and economic calculations begin to shift. What makes this moment striking is how quickly a conflict thousands of kilometers away is sending shockwaves into African economies and politics. So, what really changed for Africa after this crisis? Let's find out. The first visible impact of the United States-Iran war on Africa did not appear in African parliaments or diplomatic statements. It appeared on maritime tracking maps. Within days of tensions escalating, global shipping companies began quietly altering their routes. Vessels that normally travel through the Red Sea toward the Suez Canal, one of the most important trade corridors in the world, started avoiding the region. Instead, many of them turned south, choosing the longer but safer journey around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. At first glance, this may look like a routine logistical adjustment. Shipping companies often modify routes when security risks increase. But when you look closer, the scale of the shift becomes clear. The Red Sea-Suez route normally connects Asia to Europe in the shortest possible way. It is the highway of global trade. Billions of dollars worth of goods pass through that corridor every day. Fuel, electronics, machinery, food, raw materials, and consumer products that eventually reach markets across the world. When instability threatens that corridor, the global system reacts quickly. Ships take the longer route. That longer route runs directly along Africa. Instead of moving through the narrow channel between the Middle East and North Africa, vessels now circle the African continent before heading toward Europe. The journey adds thousands of kilometers to each trip. Fuel consumption increases, insurance costs rise, and delivery times become longer. These costs do not stay inside shipping companies. They travel through supply chains and eventually reach consumers. African economies are already beginning to feel that pressure. Countries that rely heavily on imported fuel, machinery, and food are particularly exposed. When shipping costs increase globally, the price of transporting goods into African ports rises as well. Nigeria offers one early example. Local media reports indicate that gasoline prices jumped roughly 11% shortly after the conflict intensified. Fuel markets are extremely sensitive to global transport disruptions, and even small route changes can trigger rapid price reactions. For ordinary citizens, the consequences appear quickly: higher transport costs, more expensive food deliveries, and increased pressure on household budgets. But there is another dimension to this shift that many observers are still overlooking. For decades, global maritime traffic between Asia and Europe largely bypassed the African coastline. The Suez Canal route allowed ships to move directly between the two regions without traveling around the continent. Now the map temporarily looks different. More vessels are passing along African waters. Ports that historically sat slightly outside the busiest global trade corridors suddenly lie along an alternative route connecting major markets. This does not instantly transform Africa's economic position, but it does reveal something interesting about geography. When global trade routes change, even temporarily, the strategic importance of certain locations changes with them. And if the war continues, forcing ships away from traditional corridors, one question naturally begins to emerge. If the world's cargo fleets are now moving around Africa instead of past it, what new role could African ports and coastlines start playing in global trade? The immediate answer is disruption. But beneath that disruption lies a deeper shift that many analysts are only beginning to notice. When vessels detour around the Cape of Good Hope, they do not simply pass through empty ocean. They move along African maritime zones, past coastlines that have historically played a smaller role in the busiest global shipping corridors. Countries along the eastern and southern parts of the continent suddenly find themselves closer to a route that now connects Asia, Europe, and parts of the Atlantic world. That alone changes certain calculations. long-distance cargo vessels cannot simply sail continuously without support. They need fuel, maintenance checks, spare parts, emergency docking options, and logistical services. Under normal conditions, many of these services were concentrated around traditional hubs closer to the Suez route. But when the path shifts, shipping companies begin reassessing where those services can be found along the alternative corridor. This creates new pressure on African port infrastructure. Ports in places like South Africa, Mozambique, and parts of East Africa already serve regional trade networks, but increased maritime traffic around the continent could force shipping companies to rely more heavily on these facilities for refueling, inspections, and logistical adjustments. Even temporary surges in maritime traffic can reveal how important certain ports might become if the shift lasts longer than expected. However, the situation is not automatically beneficial. In the short term, most African economies actually feel the negative side of the disruption first. Longer shipping distances increase global freight costs, and those costs affect countries that depend heavily on imports. Many African states import refined fuel, industrial equipment, pharmaceuticals, and food products. When transportation becomes more expensive, those imports become more expensive as well. This is why price movements inside African markets have started appearing so quickly. Fuel costs rise, transportation costs follow, and when transport becomes more expensive, food distribution, manufacturing inputs, and everyday consumer goods begin reflecting that pressure. For younger observers watching these developments, the situation creates a paradox. Africa is geographically closer to the new maritime route, yet many African consumers still pay higher prices because the continent remains structurally dependent on global supply chains controlled elsewhere. That contradiction raises a deeper question about the continent's long-term economic strategy. If Africa's geography can suddenly become central to global shipping when crises occur, why has the continent historically captured so little value from that position? Why have the busiest trade flows passed by African waters without significantly strengthening African logistics industries? Moments like this expose the difference between location and control. Africa has always been located near some of the world's most important maritime pathways. But the infrastructure, insurance systems, shipping companies, and financial networks that dominate global trade have historically been controlled outside the continent. When the war forced ships to reroute, the map briefly revealed Africa's geographic leverage. But geography alone does not decide outcomes. The real question now is whether African states can convert this moment, even if temporary, into a deeper conversation about logistics independence, port modernization, and control over maritime trade. And once trade routes start shifting, another question inevitably appears. If the economic map is moving, could the political map start moving with it as well? If global trade routes shifting around Africa raise questions about geography and economics, another development is unfolding at the same time, this time in the political and security sphere. Across the Sahel, governments are quietly expanding diplomatic conversations beyond the traditional partners that dominated the region for decades. To understand why, we need to look at the political transformation that has taken place across the Sahel over the past several years. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have experienced dramatic leadership changes. Military governments replaced previous administrations and began rethinking the security arrangements that had long defined their relationships with Western powers. These arrangements were originally presented as partnerships designed to stabilize the region against insurgent groups. But many governments and citizens in the region increasingly questioned whether those partnerships were actually delivering the promised security results. As a result, Sahel states began searching for alternatives. This is where recent diplomatic activity becomes important. Earlier this year, Burkina Faso's Defense Minister, General Celestin Simpore, traveled to Tehran for high-level discussions with Iranian officials. The conversations reportedly focused on security cooperation and potential technological support in the fight against armed groups operating in the Sahel. Around the same period, Niger's Prime Minister Ali Lamine Zaine also visited Iran to explore broader economic and strategic cooperation. These visits did not occur randomly or in isolation. They happened during a moment when the global security environment is becoming increasingly unpredictable. When established alliances appear uncertain, governments often diversify their relationships to avoid depending too heavily on any single external partner. For Sahel states, The logic behind diversification is straightforward. The region faces persistent insurgent threats spread across vast desert territories. These areas are extremely difficult to monitor using conventional military patrols alone. Governments, therefore, look for new technologies, intelligence support, and training partnerships that can strengthen their capacity to respond. Iran has developed a reputation in recent years for producing relatively affordable defense technologies and providing cooperation that does not always come with the same political conditions attached by Western governments. From the perspective of Sahel leaders, engaging with additional partners may simply represent a pragmatic attempt to expand their options. But the timing adds another layer to the story. These diplomatic moves are happening at the exact moment when the United States and Iran are locked in an escalating confrontation. That coincidence naturally raises questions about whether the conflict could complicate or reshape the partnerships currently being explored. If Iran becomes heavily focused on its own regional security challenges, its capacity to expand cooperation abroad may temporarily shrink. Yet the broader pattern remains visible. Sahel governments are no longer operating within the rigid geopolitical boundaries that once defined their foreign policy choices. Instead, they are experimenting with a wider range of relationships to protect their national interests. And once new security partnerships begin forming, another issue inevitably enters the conversation. Because behind almost every geopolitical relationship lies something even more strategic than diplomacy or military cooperation: resources. Which leads to the next question. Could Africa's natural resources be quietly influencing these global calculations? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If Sahel governments expanding their diplomatic options answered part of the puzzle, another layer begins to appear when we examine what Africa actually possesses beneath its soil. Because global power struggles rarely revolve only around ideology, security partnerships, or diplomacy. More often than not, they revolve around resources. And in the current geopolitical climate, few resources are as strategically sensitive as uranium. Uranium sits at the center of modern energy systems. It fuels nuclear power plants that generate electricity for millions of homes, and it plays a critical role in the technological and security calculations of many countries. Access to reliable uranium supplies, therefore, carries enormous strategic value. This is where Niger enters the picture. Niger is one of the world's notable uranium producers. According to data from the World Nuclear Association, roughly 5% of global uranium production came from Niger in 2022. That figure may seem modest, but in global energy markets it represents a meaningful share of supply. For decades, uranium from Niger flowed primarily toward partners tied to Western energy systems. Mining operations were often structured through agreements that reflected the geopolitical arrangements of the late 20th century. But political changes inside Niger have begun altering that landscape. Following the country's political transition in 2023, reports emerged suggesting that Iranian officials had shown interest in possible uranium cooperation with the Nigerian government. Some analysts speculated that such resources could contribute to Iran's civilian nuclear energy ambitions. However, journalists and regional researchers studying the issue have emphasized that no confirmed large-scale uranium deal has been finalized. At the moment, these discussions remain speculative rather than concrete. Still, the conversation itself reveals something important about the direction of global politics. When geopolitical tensions increase, countries begin paying closer attention to the resources that support energy systems, technological development, and strategic independence. Minerals that once appeared purely economic suddenly become geopolitical assets. Africa holds many of these assets. Beyond uranium, the continent possesses significant deposits of lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, and other minerals essential for modern industries ranging from renewable energy to advanced electronics. In a world where major powers are competing for technological leadership and energy security, these materials become increasingly valuable. This is why shifts in Africa's political alignments often trigger intense international interest. Control over supply chains, access to extraction rights, and long-term mineral agreements can influence the balance of power in ways that go far beyond local politics. The war between the United States and Iran, therefore, subtly intersects with Africa. As global tensions rise, strategic resources become even more important to every actor involved. And when those resources are located in Africa, the continent naturally becomes part of the broader geopolitical equation. Yet resources alone do not determine how these relationships evolve. Because even when minerals attract international attention, governments still need practical tools to address the immediate challenges they face on the ground. Which raises the next question. If Sahel states are exploring new partnerships and their resources are gaining strategic attention, what kind of technology are they actually looking for to confront the security threats within their borders? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If strategic minerals explain why Africa is gaining attention in geopolitical calculations, another reality explains why some African governments are expanding their security partnerships. The nature of modern conflict itself has changed. Across the Sahel, governments are not dealing with traditional wars between armies standing face to face on battlefields. Instead, they face insurgent groups that move across enormous territories, often using motorcycles, pickup trucks, and small mobile units that disappear quickly into remote areas. The geography of the Sahel makes this challenge even harder. The region is vast. Deserts stretch across thousands of kilometers. Borders are long and difficult to monitor. In many places, governments simply do not have enough troops or equipment to constantly patrol these areas. This is where technology begins to matter. In recent years, drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, have become one of the most important tools in modern security operations. Unlike traditional aircraft, drones can stay in the air for long periods, monitor wide areas, and transmit real-time information to security forces on the ground. For governments trying to track insurgent movements across deserts and remote terrain, that capability is extremely valuable. Iran has spent years developing a domestic drone industry capable of producing surveillance systems and reconnaissance platforms. These systems can monitor border regions, observe militant activity, and collect intelligence in locations that would otherwise be extremely difficult to reach. According to analysts studying developments in the Sahel, Niger has already begun acquiring Iranian drone systems as part of its broader security strategy. Other African governments facing similar security pressures are paying close attention to how these technologies are being used. But the significance of this shift goes beyond the drones themselves. For decades, the global market for advanced military technology was dominated by Western manufacturers. Countries seeking surveillance systems, aircraft, or advanced security equipment often had limited options and frequently faced political conditions attached to those purchases. Today, the global technology landscape is changing. Countries such as Turkey, China, and Iran have developed their own defense industries capable of producing equipment that competes in international markets. For governments looking to expand their security capabilities, this creates something that previously did not exist: choice. Instead of relying on a single source of military technology, states can now evaluate multiple suppliers offering different pricing structures, training arrangements, and political conditions. For African governments confronting urgent security threats, that flexibility can be strategically important. However, technology transfers rarely occur in isolation. When countries cooperate on security systems, they often develop deeper connections in training, intelligence sharing, and technical education. Engineers, technicians, and military personnel interact regularly, building relationships that extend beyond the hardware itself. Over time, these relationships can create broader networks of influence, which leads to a deeper dimension of the story that is often less visible than trade deals or defense agreements. Because when international partnerships grow through education, cultural exchanges, and intellectual collaboration, they begin shaping perceptions and ideas as well. And that raises the final question in this chain of events. If economic shifts, security cooperation, and technological partnerships are already linking Africa more closely to global geopolitical tensions, could cultural and intellectual networks also be quietly influencing how these relationships evolve? If security cooperation explains why drones and military technology are entering the conversation, the final piece of this story lies in something far less visible: influence built through culture, education, and ideas. International relationships rarely grow only through weapons or trade agreements. In many cases, the most durable connections between countries are formed through universities, scholarships, cultural exchanges, and intellectual partnerships that unfold quietly over years. Iran has been pursuing this type of engagement across parts of Africa for some time. Several African countries host Shiite Muslim communities, particularly in West Africa. These communities exist in places such as Nigeria, Senegal, Guinea, and Niger. While they represent a minority within Africa's broader Muslim population, they have historically maintained religious and educational connections with institutions in Iran. Through scholarships, religious training programs, cultural centers, and academic exchanges, Iranian institutions have developed networks that connect African students, scholars, and community leaders with universities and organizations in Tehran. This strategy reflects what analysts often call soft power. Unlike military cooperation or economic deals, soft power works slowly. It focuses on shaping long-term relationships through education, shared ideas, and intellectual engagement. When students study abroad, when scholars collaborate on research projects, and when cultural institutions organize events or conferences, new channels of dialogue begin forming between societies. Iran has used these channels to maintain a presence in African intellectual and cultural spaces. African students have studied in Iranian universities in fields ranging from engineering and medicine to religious studies. Academic conferences and cultural forums have occasionally brought together scholars from both regions to discuss topics including science, theology, and development. These activities may not attract headlines in the same way that security agreements or mineral deals do, but they still contribute to building long-term networks. However, the influence of these networks has limits. Africa's Muslim population is overwhelmingly Sunni, and the continent's religious traditions are extremely diverse. As a result, Iranian cultural engagement represents only one of many international influences operating across African societies. Nevertheless, the existence of these relationships demonstrates an important principle. Global influence rarely arrives through a single channel. Instead, it moves through multiple layers at once: economic connections, security cooperation, technological exchanges, and cultural relationships that gradually reinforce one another. When the United States-Iran war began reshaping shipping routes, raising fuel prices, and triggering new diplomatic conversations, it also indirectly highlighted how interconnected these layers have become. Africa is no longer simply a distant observer of global geopolitical shifts. The continent's geography now sits along alternative trade corridors. Its governments are exploring new security partnerships. Its resources are gaining strategic importance in a tense global environment. And its intellectual networks connect African societies to multiple international actors simultaneously. Each of these developments alone might appear limited, but when they unfold at the same time, they begin revealing a broader transformation. The war between the United States and Iran may have started far from African borders, yet its consequences are already moving through Africa's economies, politics, technologies, and cultural relationships, quietly positioning the continent inside a global story that it once watched from the sidelines. Let us know in the comments section. Will this war have an everlasting impact? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.